Shall we begin? It's so great to see you all. I just can't believe how lucky I am to have you attending this thing and just see you all. It's very emotionally uplifting just to see your faces. Um, we left off last time with Descartes, and we haven't finished with him, so we're going to go into him a little more, cover a couple of more spaces, and then we'll move on probably to David Hume. Uh, Descartes, as you may be aware, is the first of what they call the rationalist philosophers. The European rationalists like Leibniz, Spinoza are those are the big ones. Descartes, Leibniz, Spinoza, in that category, if you want to. And really, this goes back to Plato, and it going forward, it would be probably Heidegger and Husserl. I don't know. It's a tradition that I think came to a blunt and rude ending with David Hume, but we'll get to that. And this brings up another topic. Last week, I think we were talking. No, I think we were talking about Hobbes, and we brought up a couple of things that I said both not enough and too much about. As we go through these things, the temptation is to use a later philosopher, and this is unavoidable to a degree, use a later philosopher to criticize an earlier philosopher. And this may give you the impression that the later guys have figured it all out. And there are instances where I think that's fair, that some later guy analyzed a problem in a way that just made it go away. I think that does happen. And on the other hand, if we did that too much, I think it would be confusing and you wouldn't get a good sense for each one of these guys, which I think is just from my pedagogical point of view, uh, kind of essential. Like, okay, what did this guy say? If you take a class in philosophy and they go, well, what about the categorical imperative or something? And you say, oh, I never heard of that. It's because it wasn't um, repeated enough. And philosophy is in many ways just a matter, just like anything else, learning how to play the guitar. It's a matter of practice. Like if you study the informal fallacies, it doesn't really take a lot of study. It's more like repetition. Then you learn to spot them, just like you would learn to spot a bird. If you study birds, you can learn that bird, and you can see the informal fallacies. And that's useful. It's a useful tool. You're reading along and you go, well, a ad hominem, or that's an ad verecundium, or that's an ad populum. And the benefit of that is not necessarily that that means you dismiss the whole point of view, but you are conscious of the fact that logically they've said something that's irrelevant, even if it's emotionally satisfying. And we ran into that with the proof for the existence of God from Aquinas, the fifth way, as they call it, uh, which is a very satisfying emotional proof that everything has a purpose, and uh, the only way it could have a purpose is if there was some entity that knew what the purpose was, but we know that bugs and trees don't know what their purpose is, so there must have been somebody who did know what the purpose is in order to be able to design them with a mind, with an aim of achieving that purpose. That's very satisfying. It just happens to be not supportable. Meredith, you got your hand up?
Just a really quick thing, Tony. This brings up a question I've been struggling with, and that's the uh, the the language that we use in talking about philosophy. I'd like to have a glossary, or if
Oh,
not a glossary, then I don't know if you know if there's a source where you can see definitions of the terms that get used all the, I mean, you throw them around all the time, you
I'm
know.
sorry about that. I
No, 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 that's okay. You have to. You have to.
well,
But for us to follow you, those of us who aren't familiar, it
I
would be
mean to
nice.
I mean to avoid that as much as I can, just for that reason, because I want to make sense. That if I'm using words that have no meaning to you, I can't possibly make sense.
But
What I would
sometimes you can't talk about it without using some of those
Well,
words.
that's true, and I try to limit that, but it's impossible to completely eliminate it. So, what I would recommend, Meredith, is very simple. Just Google it. Or I have become very fond of Chat GPT, which I find in philosophy is not as, you hear all the stories about these hallucinations and so forth. I have found it to be very useful, and it's not wordy. It's very, and the advantage of ChatGPT is you can say, and by the way, it's not Musk. If you have an aversion to Musk, this isn't uh, his program. But the advantage of it is you can ask it, well, wait a minute, that didn't make sense. Can you explain it further? Or can you clarify this point? And it'll do it. So like you're having a conversation with it. So I would recommend that more than a philosophical glossary. There probably is one. I must say I don't have one, and I don't know one to recommend because they all. Here's one of the reasons that that is a little bit dangerous, and that is, unfortunately, there's no governing body like there is in astronomy to decide which planets are real planets and which ones aren't. So in philosophy, you might have a term that's used one way by one philosopher and another way by another philosopher. And so in order to understand what the term means, you kind of have to understand the whole program of what that guy is doing. So that makes it more difficult. And I think ChatGPT will kind of clear away a lot of the brush. I mean, it's a very legitimate question. It's always baffling
What is
to
it
when
you
you
just
first
said? Informal fallacies. I
informal
have no idea
fallacies
what you're
are
talking about.
okay. Okay, I can say what that is. A formal fallacy is valid or invalid only on the basis of its structure. And so the terms, whether the premises can be validated, has to depend on something outside of the proposition. Okay, uh, an example, we did this with Aristotle, but an example of a formal uh, argument is all students graduating from Pomona College have an IQ of 193. Um, Meredith graduated from Pomona, therefore Meredith has an IQ of 193. Well, that is a valid, what we call a valid argument, even though we may not be able, we could probably prove that you graduated. We may not be able to demonstrate that the conclusion is true. And also that all students, the premise, all students that graduate from Pomona have an IQ of 193 is probably not something we can demonstrate. So even though that the logic uh, of that or that conclusion doesn't follow from the argument. It's a valid argument, but it's not what we call sound. In order for it to be sound, then the premises would have to be demonstrable some way. You'd have to prove that the premises are true. And in this case, we couldn't do that. So that's a formal fallacy, is that was an example of a formal fallacy. In other words, no, excuse me, a valid formal argument, even though it's not true. Whereas an informal fallacy doesn't rely on the form of the argument. I'm not sure I'm doing a good job of explaining this, but anyway, uh, a it doesn't rely on the form of the fallacy, but more like something like, well, that's irrelevant. So an ad hominem is a classic example. Trump's favorite argument is just to insult the other person, say, well, they're an idiot. So how would they know? That's not an argument that attends to the actual merits of the argument. You don't even talk about the merits of the argument. You're just accusing the person of being an idiot. That's called an ad hominem, a very common argument, sometimes very useful in politics, particularly, but it's not one that is wrong because of its form. It's wrong because of what we call relevance. It's not relevant. Whether or not the person is an idiot has nothing to do with whether an idiot could come up with an argument that's valid just by accident, that can happen. So it doesn't matter whether he's an idiot or not, or Republican or Democrat or man or woman. That's completely irrelevant to the merits of the argument. I don't know if that distinction made any sense to you, but there are a whole list of informal fallacies. In fact, that's something you could easily Google. List of informal fallacies. And you'll see things like appeal to authority, appeal to popularity. In other words, everybody thinks this is true, so it must be true. That's the fact that everybody thinks this is true doesn't prove it. Everybody used to think the world was flat. Doesn't prove the world was flat. That you have an authority says it's true. Donald Trump says this is true, so it's true. That's an ad verecundium. Peter, you've had your hand up for a while?
Yeah, it's just a couple of books that I'd recommend with some reservations. The Oxford Companion to Philosophy will tell you fallacies, and it's in dictionary form. It also
Right.
tells you a lot more than you want to know on some subjects, and I don't agree with it on some subjects, but it's a good, the Oxford Companions are good. And a book that I read back in the 60s in high school, because my senior English teacher assigned it, Fallacy, the Counterfeit of Argument, by Fernside and Holther, is almost entirely about informal fallacies, ad hominem, and trying to get people excited or trying to confuse them. It has a little bit about fallacies and symbolic logic, and syllogisms that are incorrect because they're deduced incorrectly or a premise is wrong. But mostly it's informal fallacies. And it's kind of a simple-minded book. It was published in the 50s, and the political
Are you
example.
saying Meredith is simple-minded?
No, I'm saying that is the book that I read that I learned about informal fallacies from. No reflection on Meredith,
No, I know.
on me than anybody, but it does, it names them. It's got like 60 or 70 informal fallacies and examples. And the prime clown in the examples of fallacies is named Peter.
um, there's any number of logic books you can buy, any textbooks on logic. The only reason I said Google it is because that would be the quickest way to do it. And they'll give you a list. They'll say, list, please give a list of informal fallacies. And they'll give them, and it'll be really brief. And those fallacies are once you learn them, they stick out like a sore thumb when you see them. You go, oh, well, that's that, and it's very useful to be able to do that. Bill, you have your hand up, or Deborah, one of you
Deborah.
two?
Well,
Deborah?
maybe I can get this question answered by getting one of those books or researching it. But I was thinking about children the other day and magical thinking, and I'm just wondering if something like I wore my yellow T-shirt to school and got an A on my spelling test. So I believe that T-shirt now can create good grades. So I'm going to wear it every time I have a test. Is that a fallacy or is super?
Yes.
It is?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's called a hasty generalization.
A what?
Hasty generalization is the
And
word of
that's
the
the technical term?
yeah, and
Okay.
it just means that you've made a broad assumption based on hardly any evidence. Or you've come to a broad conclusion. Like, I dated a black girl once and she was horrible, and so all black people are horrible. That's a hasty generalization. And so your example is that, by the way, is not true. Just to clarify. Um, but that's the kind of thing that people do all the time. I met this type of person and they were a jerk. And so all people like that are jerks. That's called a hasty generalization.
It's also in the medical world, anecdotes are not evidence.
Well, yeah, and
I mean, that's
anecdotes are
exactly, and
not
you see
evidence is
case
an ex
reports are not adequate to infer things. Of course, we have people in charge of health and human services who have no understanding of any of it. But
the yeah, anecdotes are not evidence is
Isn't that similar
example
to
of a hasty generalization.
the thing about correlation is not causality?
Yeah,
yeah, that's a little different because you can have very strong correlations that tell you something important and useful, but it may have nothing to do with what the cause is.
Players who
now
are
one other thing that's relevant here that you might also be able to Google and just get a list of them is Mill's methods. There's a we have deductive and inductive logic, and in deductive logic is like the formal proposition that I just mentioned that can be true or false based on its form. Inductive logic is where you bring evidence, and the just the thing that Laurel said about correlation does not is not evidence of causation. Mill's methods is a classic a treatment of this. John Stuart Mill, Mill's methods, and this is sorting out evidence like, okay, every time I do this, this happens. Um, is A the cause of B? Every time I do A, B happens. And so Mill will categorize all these. Like, in other words, another example would be whenever A doesn't occur, then B doesn't occur. And so he has that structure all laid out. He's kind of made a catalog of all those different structures that help you determine whether the conclusion is valid or not. And so Mill's methods would be another thing to look into, Meredith. Uh, and again, I think Google is just very efficient in doing this, or ChatGPT even more so, because you don't have to be going through everything that may not be relevant to your question, because ChatGPT will allow you to limit it to what you want to know, or simplify it to what you want to know, or expand it. Uh, uh, yeah, please, honestly, please stop me at any time when you think I've used a or I have used a word that isn't clear to you, because that's no good. I mean, that doesn't advance what we're trying to do here, is just to have you confused. Um, so going back to what I was saying about using the methodologies of 20th century philosophy and we did why I brought this up was we did this with Hobbes, and I said that the idea that all actions are selfish, in other words, every human being, every action they do is selfish. I said this is non-falsifiable. That's a 20th century Karl Popper thing. Uh, Hobbes wouldn't have known about it, and it is, I think, a devastating argument against him. And I probably shouldn't have brought it up, but sometimes you just have to, because the argument against this guy, and the argument should be given to you guys, didn't occur right away. But the something that's non-falsifiable is like the existence of God is non-falsifiable, and so is Hobbes' statement that all acts are selfish, because there's no evidence that you could ever provide that God doesn't exist, because they'll just say, well, you just don't understand it. Like evil that's a pretty good argument against the existence of God. But if you're a Christian, you just say, well, we just don't understand what's going on. But that doesn't mean that God doesn't exist. So if you're a Christian, you accept that God exists, there's no evidence that could possibly be raised that would uh, invalidate that point of view. And what Karl Popper is going to say is that the statement is meaningless then if it can't be disproven. if by no conceivable test could it ever be disproven, then you haven't added anything to the conversation. I would say the same thing about Hobbes. If there's no possible way, like I gave the example of Father Damien, if you're going to say that's uh, a selfish act, that what Father Damien did, then there's no possible example you could ever give of an action that isn't selfish. Everything is selfish. And so it can't be refuted. And since it can't be refuted, you haven't really, all you've said is every action is an action or every action is intentional. That doesn't mean every action is selfish. Now, Socrates, I remember it made the distinction between Socrates and Hobbes, and it was that they agree that every action is selfish. What they disagree on is that you in Hobbes, what Hobbes assumes is every action is designed to improve your material circumstances. That may be your societal standing, it may be your money, it may be your health, but you're always trying to gain an advantage physically in the mechanical universe because Hobbes doesn't believe there's anything else other than the physical universe. The difference with Socrates is he wants to advance the idea that uh, the selfish act could be mistaken, that and one of the mistakes you could make is the only advantage you could possibly have is a material advantage, whereas Socrates wants to say, no, there are other advantages like intellectual or spiritual advantages that you could be. In other words, you're selfish, you're trying to gain more intellectual understanding of the world, but this isn't going to gain you any material advantage or uh, if it does, that's a separate issue. Socrates would say there are things you can do intentionally that would improve you spiritually, and one of them is engaging in dialectic, trying to understand the world. So Hobbes doesn't think that that would materially necessarily improve your circumstances. You could be a genius and understand the world and still be living in poverty. Um, I'm not sure if that helped at all, but uh, this is what we're here for. So don't be shy about asking for clarification for something. If I can give it, I'm more than happy to give it because, like I say, that's what we're here for. Anyway, so yeah, Meredith.
Can I just say one thing about that? What I started to say last time when we were talking about this, and I stumbled over my own tongue, was I was going to say that sometimes in my life I've done things that appear to be generous. In other words, I've agreed to give someone a ride to the doctor, or I have donated 50,000 chocolate chip cookies to a crusade of some sort. And I haven't done it because of any material advantage to me, but I've done it to increase my self-esteem and to show people what a good person I am. So I get an advantage socially from doing something that doesn't give me any material benefit, but I think of it as um, it's. Do you know what I'm trying to say, Tom?
I do, exactly. That's the whole point of Hobbes saying that all acts are selfish, that even like and I always use the example of Father Damien. You could argue that Father Damien was trying to increase his chances of going to heaven. So it was selfish that he sacrificed himself and got leprosy. Or he was trying to make himself believe that he was a saint-like person. So in that case, Meredith, I'd say yes, you were being selfish, and everything you do is selfish. But again, I would say the word just doesn't have any meaning. I would say you weren't being selfish. It doesn't have, from any person that uses language, normally they'd say, "Well, that was very generous of you." They wouldn't say, "Ah, but all acts are selfish." Who would say that? That's not how we operate as human beings. So it doesn't add anything to the assessment of your I think everybody would agree you were being generous, right? Nobody would say that's not how we use that word. And like I say, then the word selfish just has lost all its meaning. If you what you did was selfish and what Father Damien did was selfish, then there isn't any such thing as unselfishness. The word has lost any value. And in science, we always like to define what our terms are. I mean, is this a molecule of oxygen or is it a molecule of helium? We want to know what the difference is. Well, if there's no difference between actions which are selfish and unselfish, then the word has no meaning. You're squinting your face up like you don't believe me or something.
I believe you. I believe you. I just find it difficult to think about that. I, my,
You're too hard on yourself.
my brain.
Just accept that you were being generous and leave it at
But
that and
this
move
was a
on with your life.
that was not something I actually did. I was talking about an example.
Yeah, I get it. I get it.
Yeah.
Uh, but on again, this gets us into the 20th century had a whole strain of thought called common sense philosophy. It was G.E. Moore was a big guy, and it was more like stuff like that. Like Descartes talks about, I'm not sure I have a hand, right? And G.E. Moore says, well, then let me go talk to somebody else who is sane, you know? Uh, this is not a valuable conversation to me to be talking to somebody that doubts they have a hand, you know. Uh, that's kind of common sense philosophy, and it's very entertaining, and I like it. But there are problems. Like Descartes is really to try to get us back on Descartes. Descartes is bringing up something that is really uh, unique and new. I shouldn't say unique, it's new because Hobbes came up with the same idea, remember? He said that all of our ideas and perceptions and everything are phantasms. That was the word he used. The way he got there was to say that the world is material. There is no such thing as the soul. There's no such thing as gods. There's no such thing as angels. Everything in the world is physical, or else it doesn't exist. And so, therefore, if we have ideas that seem to be non corporeal, in other words, not physical, we're deluded. We're having phantasms. We're actually experiencing something that is a result of, he wouldn't have known this, but chemical and electric exchanges by cells in the brain. That's what we think now. I mean, it's just modern neurology. And the fact that results in a phantasm is a new thought that didn't exist prior to Hobbes and Descartes. Descartes and Hobbes knew each other, by the way. And then Descartes comes from a different direction to arrive at essentially the same conclusion. We would call it phenomenological. In other words, what his experience is. And he's going, well, what if my experience is, how can I prove my experience is real? Because when I have a dream, it seems like I'm having a real experience, and yet I'm not. So how do I know I'm not dreaming right now, at this moment? And all you guys are just uh, figments of my imagination. How can I prove that? And Descartes wants to start with a point for his philosophy. He wants to start at a point of absolute certainty, and that's what we're going to get to today. He believes he's arrived at it with the thing I can't doubt is that I'm having an experience. And I think Peter pointed out last time that the problem with this is what is having an experience, and uh, do we know it's a single thing that's having an experience? Because I said I as though it refers to something, but maybe it isn't a singular thing. Maybe it's multiple things that are having this experience. And there's a variety of ways of approaching that problem, and Hume's going to get to one when we get there. But um, so both Hobbes and Descartes have thrown a monkey wrench into all the prior philosophy that assumed that what we were seeing was actually real. We could make mistakes. We could think it was uh, Sunday when it was actually Monday or something like that. We can make mistakes about what reality is, but the idea that all of it is not real is new with Hobbes and Descartes. So, um, what Descartes does, so far so good, I would say, for Descartes, because this is legit. It's not inconsistent with what we believe nowadays, because we know that as I mentioned, you can suffer a brain injury, you could take drugs. All these things are physical things that happen to the mechanism that produces your ideas and your perceptions. And yet, that can change what you perceive, right? So we all assume that the brain, which is a physical um, entity, is producing these non-corporeal, in other words, non-physical thoughts and perceptions. We all kind of say that's what's going on. And there's all kinds of therapies. If you think your brain's gone haywire, some therapies are talk therapies. You talk to a therapist. Others are physical. You need a drug intervention or you need an operation because you got a tumor or whatever. And so we know that the brain can malfunction, and sometimes the malfunction is caused by physical things. Let's put it that way. Now, yeah, Peter.
On that point, I think it's fair to say that Plato knew that too, though in a more limited area. That is, if you're familiar with an experience like delirium, you're well aware that there are things that are physical that can interfere with the functioning of the mind. Um, I mean, I'm not saying that Plato's position is exactly the same. I'm only saying that the recognition that physical things interfere with thoughts or stimulate thoughts goes way, way back. And the assumption that that has an electromagnetic explanation or a chemical explanation, though it might be fruitful of possibilities, is really also just an assumption.
Now, it's interesting you say that. I can't uh, think of a passage where Plato actually mentions something like that. But
No, I can't either, but he
on the
would,
other hand, he's not so stupid that he wouldn't have been aware that somebody gets their head knocked in a battle, that
right.
they can't have a concussion and not know where they are. He must have known that.
Yeah,
However, he didn't make, I don't remember Plato ever making anything of it, nor Aristotle, nor anybody prior to these guys.
yeah. Well,
They didn't want to make a metaphysical point about that. Certainly, they must have recognized it, though. So, what were they, stupid or what? Anyway, I want to go on to what Descartes does next, which is highly dubious, I think. And so I have the meditations here. His two big books. Look how little this is. This is one of the most famous books in philosophy. It's a little pamphlet. This is the Meditations on First Philosophy, and his other big book is called, also just as small, is called Discourse on Method. These are the two main texts from Descartes that are famous. Anyway, here's what he says after he's arrived at the point which is always called the cogito in philosophy. In other words, I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum. That's the Latin. He wrote in Latin. So, anyway, here's what he says next. He says, I've proved to myself that I am a thinking being. Then he says, but what am I? A thinking being. What is a thinking being? It is a being which doubts, which understands, which conceives, which affirms, which denies, which wills, which rejects, which imagines, and which perceives. Now, he uses all these words that are familiar to anybody that knows the English language, or I guess Latin. However, there is a pertinent 20th century criticism of this. And it comes from Wittgenstein, basically. And the idea is that no words for mental processes are actually private. And the idea is there's no private language, is what Wittgenstein says. And the idea is that every one of these words, if I um, every one of these words would be accompanied by something you could perceive. And the reason Wittgenstein says this is if we didn't have any referent for the word, if the referent for the word only existed in your brain, in your mind, then there would be no common exchange. There'd be no way that I could tell you what I'm thinking or that you could tell me what you're thinking because you're referring to some thing that only occurs in your brain. So whatever the language is, it must be public, no private language. You must be referring to things that are public. And so each one of these terms has a public way of making sense and not a private way. So let me just take an example. It's a being which doubts. Well, um, actually, let me not do that one because we just got through a bunch of doubt. Um, which wills. Okay, if I say somebody wills to do something, um, I would expect that this would be accompanied by some evidence of them willing it. In other words, they're doing things. I wish I will myself to get a college degree. However, I'm just drinking all day. So I have every reason to believe that you don't have a very strong will to go to college. You don't really have a will. You're lying to yourself. In other words, I can verify publicly whether you really will to do this or whether you're telling yourself a fib. And that's true of all these words are actually accompanied by public actions. Which affirms, okay, I affirm that I'm sitting here. Well, no, that's Descartes. But let's say I affirm that I see Debbie, and then if I say no, I don't think I do see Debbie, I I'd be questioning the person that was making contradictory statements uh, that are publicly visible and available. Like I had a friend, one of my oldest friends, she was always saying she was depressed, and yet she was invariably cheery and funny. And I said, um, you're going to have to give me a little more evidence of your depression. Uh, you're saying something that's contrary to my experience of you. You're going to have to explain. Do you finish every conversation with me and then cry? I don't see any evidence of you being depressed. I'm not doubting you're depressed really, but I don't understand how you're using the word. You're energetic, you get out of bed, you do lots of stuff, you're funny, you read a lot. And so you're going to have to do better in explaining what your depression is. So anyway, the point is just the technical point is everything he's saying actually has a public uh, test to see if it's really true. And so the point is that Descartes couldn't say all those things unless the real world existed, where those words mean something. And so, who is he talking to when he says this? If he doesn't even believe the outside world exists and he doesn't believe you exist, and he's not sure he has a mouth, what sense that he can't go ahead and make these statements that are actually statements of public activities? So that's one argument against he's already gone too far. He's already gotten too far over his skis. Now the next thing he's going to do is prove the existence of God. Let me see if I have that here. The let me see. Okay, uh, I'm not going to read that, but the okay, his proof for the existence of God is a version of the ontological argument of Saint Anselm, although we didn't go over that. But the argument from his version of the argument is this: I find that in my mind I have a picture of a perfect being, and since this is a principle from scholasticism, since the lesser cannot cause the greater, then my mind, which is finite and a mere human mind, could not have be in possession of the idea of a perfect being. The idea of a perfect being could only be created by a perfect being, not by me. And so, since I have an idea of a perfect being, it must have been caused by a perfect being, and that's not me, so therefore God exists. That's the argument. Uh, this is just hogwash. I mean, first of all, how do I know? I mean, just to start with, how do I know I have an idea of a perfect being? How do I know it's perfect unless I'm perfect? In other words, how can I judge whether it's a perfect idea unless I? Do you remember Meno's paradox? Meno's paradox was if I'm going to say somebody is virtuous, I have to already know what virtue is, or I wouldn't have any way of identifying it. Same thing applies here. How do I know the picture I have in my mind is perfect unless I'm already perfect? I'd have to already be in possession of the knowledge, the perfect knowledge of a perfect being in order to judge whether it was perfect or not. But he says that he's a finite being and doesn't have that kind of knowledge. Um, I would one way of one analog of this is saying, well, I'm going to have all the students' papers in class graded by this student who can't read English. And he's going to judge whether or not you have written a really great paper. That's what we're doing here. I mean, Descartes himself says that I'm just a finite, regular old dude. How could I have this idea of a perfect being? Well, what you're saying is the dumbest guy in the class is judging the perfection of the smartest guy in the class. That doesn't make any sense, and Descartes can't tell me that it does. So I'm not buying this argument. I think it's one of the dumbest arguments in the history of philosophy myself, but maybe you like it. And by the way, here's one other point I wanted to make earlier. When we say arguments are not valid, that doesn't mean you can't believe them. I mean, I can't, just earlier I said the idea of God is non-falsifiable. That doesn't mean you can't believe in God. You can believe anything you want. Remember, going back to Socrates, that our job is to distinguish opinion from truth. Well, truth can be validated one way or another. Opinion can't. That doesn't mean opinion isn't. We haven't proven the opinion is wrong. We've just proven that what you're saying proves it doesn't prove it. That your proof doesn't rise to the level of having proven what you want to prove, and so it's okay to still believe it. All of us, I think we mentioned this last time, all of us believe and live by things that we could never prove. Like, I think my wife's a pretty good person. How would I prove that? I guess I could prove it. I think that life is pretty wonderful. How could I prove that? I can't prove these things. And yet, these are core things that I believe. It's not that I It's not that I care to prove God doesn't exist. I'm just saying, Descartes, you haven't proven to me he exists. I'm just going to believe it anyway, but you haven't proven it. Now, I think the first hand up was Bill. So let's go to where'd he go?
That's me
What?
again. Okay, I'm getting a stomach ache.
It's not Bill, it's Deborah. Okay, go ahead.
I'm getting a little anxiety attack here. And I understand that Plato didn't believe in a God in the way that say Descartes did. But how is Descartes' idea of perfection in his brain any different from Plato's idea of the forms? Or Plato just doesn't have an idea about where the forms came from. He just thinks that things must be moving towards perfection because he sees so much imperfection on earth. To me, they seem like the exact same argument.
Uh, I would say one basic difference is that Plato isn't trying to prove that anything perfect
Right.
exists. Remember, Plato is so slippery because he never says what he thinks. He just believes that in order to understand things, it's Meno's paradox. How do I understand this is true? Well, I must understand it because I know what truth is, or I know what virtue is. How did I come by that knowledge? I don't know. Whereas Descartes
Mm,
kind of going the other direction. He's saying,
mm.
well, I don't know how I came by it, so it must have been God.
Wasn't there
So
reincarnation involved in that?
in
Uh,
Plato, yeah, Plato,
uh-huh.
uh, but then again, remember, this is not something he proves. He just tells a myth. Maybe somehow we were in a former life familiar with the forms. Maybe that's the case. He doesn't say that's the case. He says, well, there's this myth, the myth of Ur in the end of the Republic, where so maybe it's that.
So
So
you just like the idea that he doesn't really, he's willing to live with uncertainty. He doesn't make definitive answers. And Descartes, in his oh so French way, wanted, you know.
the okay, that's a very good point. The essence of rationalism that really comes from Aristotle more than Plato and lives through the Middle Ages and the scholastics. The essence is to believe that logic comes first. And so the world must correspond. It must correspond to logic.
Mm,
The real world must correspond to logic. In other words, there's a metaphysical truth in logic, isn't it? It isn't just a relationship between the words we're using. It actually applies to reality. And this was
mm,
believed through it was believed by Aristotle, was believed through the Middle Ages, and Descartes, Leibniz, and Spinoza all agree with this. And
mm.
this is going to be destroyed by David Hume, I'd like to say. Um, which we will get to. But why do I like Plato? There's just too many answers to that question. But certainly, this is one that I emphasized from the start that he demonstrates what philosophy is. He doesn't say what it is. He
Mhm.
demonstrates what he thinks it is.
Like a
Is
good
that Anne
writer,
with? I'm sorry. What,
like a
Deborah?
good writer, you know, it's better to show it
So,
than to,
oh,
yeah,
Then,
yeah.
yeah, that's what Hemingway said too. Is
Mhm.
Anne? Do you have your hand up?
Yeah. So I want to know, what is Descartes' basis for arguing that animals are machines?
Animals are
He's the,
machines. I'm not
the-
sure. uh,
he's the big enemy of environmental thinking.
I'm not
Seriously.
familiar with that. Where does he say that?
Can you talk about it?
neither of us have actually read Descartes, and I've only read a little bit about him, but I have read in secondary sources that he claimed, he basically claimed that the res extensa, the matter of the material world, is mechanical and can be explained mechanically. And we have souls, supposedly, so we can't be explained that way, but animals don't have souls, which was the orthodoxy of his time. So they are pure machines. And there were Cartesians who experimented on animals, not so much to learn things about them, which is a
Hmm.
different kind of reason, but to show that they weren't superstitious. I I,
Um,
I have read that,
this
and
is the
in a fairly scholarly book, though not a book by a philosopher.
this is the typical. I don't know if you saw. I think I posted this. This is a typical scholastic point of view, and Descartes an inheritor of the this
Sure.
kind of methodology of thinking. But Aquinas had a hierarchy from God to angels who were not as perfect as God, but also were not corrupted by having bodies. And they had souls only. And then there are people who have souls, but they're corrupted by having a physical body. And then there's animals who don't have souls, and they are just like you say, mechanical. And by the way, when I was a kid, I was taught that fish can't feel pain because they don't have souls, they don't have minds. You may have thought the same. The Jains in India believe that everything has souls, so they have somebody walk in front of them that can sweep the ground just in case they step on something. They want to avoid killing any soul. Um, so this is
In Aristotle, isn't there the vegetative soul that
yeah.
plants have, then the sensory soul that animals have, and then the rational soul that only humans have?
That's
So
right.
it isn't as extreme as Descartes. They are inferior to us in the chain of being, but they are not parts of a machine. And it does seem that both Descartes and Spinoza, however much one respect has, however much respect one has for them, saw things through the analogy of machine, maybe to an extent that goes beyond the facts. Because you can figure some things out by treating everything as a machine, even maybe the circulation of the blood, say, or, the way parts of the brain, aspects of the brain work. But there are things you're going to miss if you see things as machines.
Well, it's
And
basically what medical science believes to this day. I mean,
I
uh,
get it, but I'm not sure it's altogether right.
well, I mean, that's the mind-body problem. How do you account for the fact that we have these ideas? Are they really caused by just a bunch of electrochemical reactions among molecules inside your noggin? That's that's a real problem. It's not like it's been resolved, and we still kind of look at the body as a machine. Who is anybody? Nobody's a medical doctor here, are they?
But the body is a machine to some
Yeah,
extent. The
yeah,
question is whether it's also something else. And I'm not
yeah. Well,
about
the
a discredited vitalism of the 19th century, but the sense that there is something going on there that can't be explained by the analogy of a lever or a pulley or a computer.
Okay, let me, since you brought up res extensa and res cogitans just a minute ago, these are the two Latin terms that Descartes uses to describe the mind and the body. So there are things that are extended in space, like anything physical, and then there are things that understand, res cogitans, things that understand the other things. And uh, he said, okay, so what's how do the two interact? Believe it or not, he said they interact through the pituitary gland, which unfortunately is part of the physical world. So I'm not sure he's answered any questions there. Yeah, Peter.
It was the pineal gland
Oh,
because
pineal, yeah, pineal
was
gland.
it was
Sorry.
already understood that the pituitary gland had something to do with normal biological growth, but nobody had any idea what the pineal gland was for. So apparently Descartes said, aha, it must be where the soul lives.
Right. So thanks, Peter. I'm glad you're around to correct me when I fuck up. But uh,
Okay, I'll take it.
the pineal. But the point is, gland, whatever gland it is part of the physical world, and
Right.
so it doesn't solve the problem at
No,
all. He
no,
hasn't.
no. Does
And in the 20th century, this was addressed by a guy named Gilbert Ryle, who said what Descartes has done is made a category mistake. That's what he calls it, and that means that he said there are two substances, and you've already gone off the track of these two substances. One is corporeal and one isn't. Well, what do you mean by a substance that's not, doesn't have any physical being? And Hume is going to address this soon. Uh, what does that mean? There's a substance, and what it is a thinking thing that doesn't have any body. Does that sound like a substance to you? What is the substance? Well, you could say this person has no substance, I guess. But you wouldn't be quite meaning the same thing that he doesn't have consciousness. You'd mean that he has no backbone or something like that. So we'd understand what you mean, which is again going to from and to everyone, and look at we covered about, for instance, elephants. Um, yeah, I'm well, I think earlier I mentioned maybe one of the first meetings I was talking about intelligence, and I said just recently, an octopus is a mollusk. They're like clams, right? They're in that same is it class or phylum? I think it's class, but I could be wrong. Anyway, uh, the fact that they have brains and nine brains and is just so inconceivable to us. But it's just recently that we thought that we observed octopuses enough to see that they were intelligent. They could figure out problems. And so I think it's pretty, this is within our lifetime. This is a change I think that's occurred within our lifetime to think that animals are conscious and they the reluctance, there's a reluctance there to a degree on the part of ethologists because they don't want to overstate their case and say they're just like us, because what that does is import a human interpretation to what may not be a human-like experience. And I like to use the octopus because the experience of the octopus seems so inconceivable to me that I don't see how we could say, oh, yeah, they're feeling bad today. I mean, I guess they do. Gerald says Descartes' proof is essentially a string of unproven and possibly unprovable. Yeah, that's right. But remember, Descartes is still laboring under the assumption, so is Leibniz, so is Spinoza, that somehow logic dictates what the real world is. That if it doesn't correspond to logic, it couldn't be real, and if it does, then it must be real. And like I say, Hume's gonna kind of explode this, I believe. Let me see if there's something else that I want to mention about Descartes. I think that's about it for us. Now, I, in order to do this class, we a lot of times have to, I don't want to say gloss over, but we have to encapsulate what the main thoughts of somebody are, and that perforce leaves out a lot of subtlety and arguments, counter arguments. But I've lived with these guys literally for 60 years. And when I say I've lived with them, I don't mean I've studied them like an academic. I mean, I think about them when I'm sailing. I think, well, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. And they just rattle around my brain all the time. And I'm willing to say that there's some of these guys are uh, barking up the wrong tree. Let's say that about Descartes. Let's just say that. He's very important because for the reason I mention him, and that is that he's the first guy that I know of that actually conceived of the fact that your brain may be just a bunch of hallucinations. This is an original idea, and it's important because what it's going to it requires an answer. It requires that you respond to that, and there are people that who are going to respond to it, and those are mainly for our purposes Kant and I don't know if we'll talk about Heidegger, but Kant and the existentialists are going to respond to it in a certain way. But on the other hand, his problem has not been resolved. The mind-body problem is still, in fact, it's not even clear how you think about it. We know for a fact that we can operate on the brain or we can do an fMRI and see what's going on. That doesn't help. That doesn't help anything. It doesn't really solve this problem at all. Uh, yeah, Peter.
Um, a point I've been trying to read Descartes, but I don't have any Descartes, so I've only been reading bits and things about him. Voltaire made an interesting criticism about Descartes with regard to science. He thinks that Bacon is on the right track because Bacon believes in observation and experiment. And he says the Chancellor Bacon um, uh, uh, opened a road which science might follow. And then Descartes appeared and did just what he should not have done. Instead of studying nature, he tried to divine it. He goes on, this best of mathematicians made only romances in philosophy.
Yeah, well, that is the essence of the rationalist movement. So the rationalists did the kind of thing that Descartes did. They thought they could deduce. Remember, Descartes' program was to reduce everything he experienced down to a principle that he knew was absolutely true and could not be doubted. And he thought he did that with the cogito ergo sum. I'm going to doubt everything that I see. I'm going to doubt that there are other people. I'm going to doubt that I have a body. But there's one thing I can't doubt that I'm having, and that's that I'm having an experience. What he thought was that, like in mathematics, he'd arrived at an axiom from which he could build up a system, and that would clearly exhibit reality for him without any clear and distinct is the phrase he uses, without any vagueness, without any chance of mushiness or anything like that. It would be clear and distinct if he started. The idea was if he started with a principle that was absolutely true. And that's what he thought he'd done. And he was just wrong. So, Leibniz and Spinoza followed this kind of line of reasoning, and it's not something we're going to engage ourselves in. We're going to go right to Hume, who destroys all this stuff, like throws a Molotov cocktail in the whole history of philosophy, and doesn't care who knows about it. Uh, so we'll do that next time. Hume, by the way, this does kind of offend me. I may have mentioned this that Hume's name was taken off a building at the University of Edinburgh because somebody discovered some racist things that he'd written in private letters. And I'm not one for going through history and throwing people all of their accomplishments out because of one thought that we don't approve of these days. I'd have to never listen to a Chuck Berry record if that were the case. Um, I just I just think it's just a weird thing. It's a weird kind of super puritanical, purist thing to
Yeah.
do. And I don't know if he was a big racist. He didn't write about it. He never wrote about it. And privately, the idea that you wouldn't be racist in the time of Hume, everybody was racist. Everybody thought the dark races were inferior. There probably were people that didn't think that, but they weren't the common person. So I'm not willing anyway, but I'm a big admirer of Hume, and that's kind of weird because
You cannot judge a person.
Hume was one of the guys that when I started reading philosophy, I couldn't believe how dull he was. And now I find him just very hilarious and just solid as a rock. He's really great. And by the way, that's how he was received at first. He was famous for writing a history of England, but then when he wrote his philosophy, nobody paid any attention to it. It was just kind of dead on arrival until Kant picked it up. And then Kant went,
Really?
"Uh-oh, everything's been everything's been turned upside down." And then so Kant addressed that. So next time we'll go on with Hume, unless we have more comments and questions and discussions.
I just want to say on Descartes that we should really be grateful for Cartesian coordinates
Oh yeah, well,
because, because of maps and things based on Cartesian coordinates. So he kind of made navigation possible. So whenever you use GPS to find yourself, somewhere underlying this, there are Cartesian coordinates or the global version of them, the spherical version. And if it's impossible to get lost in Chicago if you have any math sense because the streets are ordered in one direction by numbers and in the other by the sequence of presidents.
Yeah,
Although
that's just
Trump
because they had a
Street,
fire.
Clinton's out of order.
you know, Laurel, I'd never even thought about that before. I'd have to look at what the history of the latitude and longitude grid was, and this is something I know quite a bit about navigation, and that's a very interesting point. I never related the two, even though you got an X and Y axis, which is what you have in longitude and latitude. Also, I don't know if that followed Descartes or not. That's very interesting.
Well, you can
I'm gonna right after we get off here, I'm gonna look into that.
Down the rabbit hole.
Yeah.
I
Well,
think that
that should be a fairly straightforward question. I mean, did the people who developed the grid follow Descartes' coordinate
they
idea?
certainly set an origin for it. So we
But
have the
what came first, though? You'd have to ask yourself what came first.
anyway. So I think that it's certainly consistent with Descartes' way of organizing spatial descriptions. Anyway, I'm grateful to Descartes because I've certainly,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mentioned that at first. I said we're not going to talk about that.
you did.
That's math stuff, and it's not like that's way more viable and useful than his proof for the existence of God.
Well, it's something that exists separately from it's sort of like the numbers, two. Where does two come from? But that we could come up with this anyway. So I liked that, and
Hmm.
I did put a couple of things in the notes that I thought were
Oh, you did? Let's in the chat.
in the chat. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I hadn't got to the chat yet.
No, that's
Let's
okay. But
see.
anyway, I
Yeah.
wanted to just say, although I think I agree with you that what we've heard of Descartes has flaws, that he was cool about the grid system.
Yeah, well, I mentioned, yeah, the, he was so attracted to the idea of mathematical purity. That's what informed his orientation towards philosophy. He was looking for the same kind of purity in thought that he found in mathematics. And unfortunately, words are not as stable and clear as mathematical concepts. And so, especially when you talk about words like God. So he really wanted to be clear, like math. That was his model. Well, to be fair, Plato valued mathematics. I mean, he thought geometry, you had to understand that as the key to understand or thinking about anything. So this can be traced back to Plato, that kind of idea.
Yeah, Laurel, it's an interesting question. Oh, I'm not on. Um, I mean, Descartes and Newton were contemporary, and they were both responsible for developing calculus and so forth. And it'd be very interesting to see. I mean, you almost can't look at what Newton is doing without an idea of coordinates behind it. It would be very interesting to see how that interplay of ideas went. I have no idea.
No, I don't either, but it's that, and I don't know, Tony, whether how much you will touch at all on the role of mathematics in sort of underpinning some of these abstractions and the
Well,
ability.
I just Googled it, Laurel, and it goes back to Eratosthenes and Aristarchus, the idea of latitude and longitude.
Cool,
So
but they didn't.
it's a pretty ancient idea, but
But Descartes
they didn't have the XY coordinates that you're talking about.
better.
Yeah, they didn't apply it to graphs. Yeah, latitude and longitude, knowing north, south, and east, west. I think those north, south, and east, west, and measurements along that have been around for a long time. We have the north wind, south wind, east wind, west wind distinction.
Y'all doing okay today?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Although it was easier to figure out latitude than longitude because latitude is constant. Longitude is not because of curvature. So the only way they figured that one out was by time.
Yeah,
They had to invent a reliable timing to be able to figure out where you are on the in longitude.
fascinating books on that.
There's a beautiful book called Longitude by Darva Sobel, I think her name is.
Yeah,
That's a wonderful book about the discovery Harrison's clock.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's it.
you can't.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
have to have a timepiece, which is not a problem anymore. But at the time it was killing people because they didn't know what their longitude was and they just ran into things. They in the fog they would just run into um, the coast of Britain, and so the Crown put out a tremendously huge. It's some gigantic number, like maybe $5 million or something as a prize. That's how big of a problem it was for the British Navy. And then Harrison finally got his money at the end, but he had to fight with Newton. The board of people that were uh, kind of opposing him weren't necessarily clockmakers. They thought there's another method to determine it, which is much more impractical than a clock. But a clock seemed impossible to them. And so it was a long time before all these bigwigs who were very important people and lords and stuff. And this guy was, poor John Harrison was just some tinkerer that invented the clock. And it took a long time for the crown to be convinced that he was smarter than Newton. Yeah, Peter.
The thing about a clock is that the motion of a ship or a boat will throw it off. So Harrison needed not only to invent a really accurate clock, but a clock that would remain accurate on a rolling, pitching ship. And
That was
that's
a
what he
business. Yeah.
did.
Yeah, that was a business for sure. And he did it. Yeah, it was a hell of a project that he undertook. But so longitude, right, wasn't solved until we knew what time there was. But latitude, the grid defined by latitude was, I guess, goes back to Eratosthenes and Aristarchus, who were, third century BC Greek guys. Anybody else? Well, it's just a delight as always to see everybody. So wonderful. And we'll reconvene on Thursday and start to talk about David Hume.
All
So
right.
Thank you, Tony.
until
Thanks,
then,
Tony.
Yeah,
stay well.
and
Thank
I wish
you.
that Anne gets more than 20 pounds of she can
Yes.
stand on.
Yes. Good luck, Ann.
Yes.
Thank you, bud. Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.